is my first tube guitar amp, my Port City Pearl. It's from 2010. I got it while I was at AIM, actually right before I graduated AIM and started working as a guitar player. And this amp holds a ton of sentimental value to me for two reasons. One, this amp helped me get a lot of work in my early years as a guitar player. When I didn't really know what I was doing, I was trying to figure it out. I was playing all different types of gigs. I'd play a bar gig in Buckhead till 2 or 3 in the morning, then go home and shower and change and go straight to a church gig on Sunday morning. I was playing with singer-songwriters, taking the occasional session when I could. I was trying to figure it out, and this amp was with me the entire way. It was my one amp to do everything with. And it also represents the first major step forward that I personally had in finding my voice or finding my sound on guitar. So I thought about what I wish I knew when I was looking for this first amplifier, because at the time I didn't know anything. So that's what today's video is about, what I wish I knew when I was looking for my first tube amp. Now, before we jump into the video, a quick plug for the tone course. This is a video course I made all about the ins and outs of great guitar tone, and we have a whole section dedicated to tube amps and getting different styles of tones and sounds out of a tube amp. If you want more information and a 35% discount on the tone course, follow the link in the description box down below. Back in 2010, I was at school for music. I was at Atlanta Institute of Music for guitar. And when I started AIM, I had never touched a tube amp before in my life. I was completely self-taught growing up. I didn't know any guitar players growing up. I didn't take lessons or anything, and no one in my family knew anything about guitar. So I had a Vox modeling amp for a few years that got me through and sounded good. But my first night at AIM, I walked up on stage for a performance class, plugged into a Marshall Vintage Modern half stack, and was confused as to why no sound was coming out. And it's one of my more embarrassing moments, but one of my teachers, Carl Culpepper, had to walk up on stage and flip the amp off of standby for me to get the sound out. I mean, that's where I was in 2010. Now, I quickly learned the basics of amps and, standby switches and all that, but it took me a while to figure out what I wanted. I knew pretty quickly that I needed an amplifier to get me through, to use when I get hired for gigs and to play out, something that would work in a wide variety of situations. Keep in mind, YouTube wasn't as big as it is now. I couldn't just jump on and watch a ton of reviews on amplifiers, and I wasn't super hip to things like the Gear page at the time. So my only resource was Atlanta Discount Music, my local guitar shop. I used to go down there a couple times a week and just talk to Jimmy down there. And he taught me the basics of tube amps. He taught me about power tubes, the difference between 6L6s and EL34s. He taught me about the differences between a Fender amp and a Vox and a Marshall and what they're good for, the sounds that they're known for. Talk me through different features. Do you want a head and a cab or a combo? How many watts do you want? Do you want built-in reverb? What a tone stack does. I learned all that stuff early on from that shop, and those guys being really patient with a complete novice and someone that was more than likely embarrassing themselves without noticing it. And it all came to a head when I settled my search down to a clean Fender style amp, which is what this is, and a Mesa triple rectifier. Now, if you know anything about tube amps, you know it's hard to get further apart than those two amplifiers, but I didn't know. I didn't know what I wanted, and I didn't know what I needed. But one of the amps that was on the performance stage at AIM, at school, was a Port City. It was the predecessor to this amp, the Port City 5050. And I just knew that every time I plugged into that amp, I liked the way it sounded. It made me feel comfortable and confident when I played it. And I figured out that around that same time, Daniel, the owner and builder behind Port City, was coming out with this amp, the Pearl. And so that's how I ended up with it. Now, if you're not familiar, this is a completely clean 50-watt pedal platform amp. It's designed to take pedals really well. And for me starting out, that was the perfect thing, because at the time, I really didn't know what I wanted. And because I was playing such a wide variety of gigs, bar gigs, church gigs, singer-songwriter, country artists, doing sessions for gospel artists, all different types of stuff, I needed an amp that could span the gamut. And that's exactly what the Pearl did. You could stick a myriad of different pedals in front of it and completely revoice and change the character of the amp to suit whatever gig I was on. Now, since then, I've gone on to collect quite a few other amplifiers that cover all of those jobs that the Pearl was able to do with a little help from some pedals, and so it's been sitting in storage for a little while, but I decided to pull it out for today's video. But there's a few key things that I wish I would have known early on about amplifiers that would have really helped me out in my search, would have really saved me a lot of time, and would have really helped me get to the right decision a lot earlier. I do think this was the right first amp for me, and if I could go back and change it, I don't think I would, but here's some things that I wish I knew. One of the first things I wish I understood was wattage, or your amp's power output. Now this is a 50 watt amp. It has two 6L6 power tubes in the back, and it outputs 50 watts, give or take. And that's a pretty powerful amplifier. Now, when I was first looking, I was really confused. This is one of the biggest things I had trouble deciding. Did I need a big, powerful amp, 100 watts, that would get across any room and get over any drummer? Or did I need something small and easy to carry and only 15 watts because I was likely going to be mic'd up on every single gig? And this is something that's important to consider. What are you going to be using this amplifier for? Are you playing mostly at home in your music room and you want something that just sounds great and gives you the feel and the tones of all your favorite players and your favorite tube amps? Well, then you probably don't need that powerful of an amp. Something 10, 15, 20 watts maximum is what I would go for. If you start going above that, I mean, even 20 watts is a really loud amplifier. You're gonna need some kind of power attenuator or some kind of load box to keep the volume at a reasonable level if you're playing at home. Now, let's say you're gonna be doing some gigs. You're like I was. You're gonna be doing a wide variety of gigs, playing in bars, playing in churches, playing events, and you want something that's still easy to load in and out by yourself, but is going to be loud enough to get over just about any drummer. You might need to be loud enough to play without a mic, which was what I was finding myself in. Well, I think something 20 to 50 watts is right around what you should be looking at. And in fact, for most gigging situations now, even playing on big stages, big arenas, I really don't think you need more than 40 or 50 watts. That's a really loud amplifier. With this amp right now, I'm going through the aux, so it's actually being somewhat attenuated. I'm listening through the monitors on my desk. But with the volume at noon here, if this was going through its 212 cabinet, it would absolutely be peeling paint in this room. You couldn't be in the same room as this amplifier at half volume. Again, for me, I think most players, the sweet spot is 15 watts on the low end and 30 to 40 watts on the high end. 50 watts is as loud as I would ever need for any gig. And when I was gigging with this amp with its 212 cab, I really never got the volume above about there, 11 o'clock on the dial. It really moves some air. The next thing to think about is how you're going to use your amp in terms of the overall rig. What role is it going to play in your sound? Now, this, like I mentioned earlier, is a pedal platform amplifier, and I knew that at the time I was going to be building a pretty decent pedal board because I needed a wide variety of sounds. So I knew that the pedal board was going to do most of the heavy lifting in terms of my gain staging, the overdrive sounds I was going to need to get, in terms of the effects like reverbs and delays. Now, there are lots of amplifiers out there that will do this pedal platform thing really well. In fact, almost any amplifier can be a good pedal platform depending on how you set it up. But if you're going to be more of a bare bones kind of player, you're going to use just a couple of different sounds and you want the amplifier to do more of the heavy lifting in terms of the overdrive and the gain sounds that you might be going for. Something like this, I wouldn't recommend. The Pearl, or another high headroom, high wattage clean amp, isn't really going to break up on its own in a nice way at a reasonable volume. Now, this amp will break up, but like I said, because it's 50 watts, it's high headroom, the volume levels at which it starts to break up are just insane. So a quick example here. I've got the amp set up in a pretty kind of balanced, middle of the road, clean sound. There's a little bit of spring reverb in the front coming from my AxeFx, and this is what it sounds like. Now, depending on what pedal I put in front of the amplifier, I can turn it into a myriad of other different amps. It can be sort of a chameleon. So right now I've got the Vertex Ultraphonics, the version 2.0, and I'm essentially going to turn this into a Dumble Overdrive Special. Now that's a sound that this amp is not capable of on its own, but because it's such a sort of clean and transparent amplifier, it's going to take that revoicing really, really well. Another amp like my Morgan AC20 Deluxe is a great pedal platform amplifier, meaning it takes reverbs and delays and overdrives really well, but its overall sound is a little more colored. It has its own character that it's always going to impart no matter what you put in front of it. So it'll still do that Dumble kind of thing if I put a Dumble kind of pedal in front of it, but it's not going to be as clear of a shift as this amp is. Same thing with other Fender style amps, like a Tweed style amp. A Tweed amp, like a Tweed Deluxe, can take pedals really well, but it's always going to have that tweediness to it because of the amp's tone stack and because of the preamp circuit. It's always going to impart its flavor on top of what you're doing. It's not a bad thing, it just depends on what you're looking for. So the next thing to think about is the practicality and the features of your amp. And this goes back to how are you going to use it. First thing is head and cab versus a combo. Combos are more convenient. You have one thing to load in and out. They're a little bit smaller. They take up less space in your home or apartment, but they have their downsides. With the combo, the chassis and the cabinet are in the same space, so the vibrations of the speaker end up rattling the chassis, which can do things like wear out tubes and other components a little faster. Now, as you can see, I prefer heads and cabinets over combos, and there's a few reasons for it. A, if you're doing a lot of recording at home, you can do things like mix and match heads and different cabinets with different speaker combinations and open back and close back. Also, if you have a couple of good cabinets, you can just buy multiple heads, which is a little bit more cost effective than buying combo versions of every amplifier, and they're a little easier to move around, especially with things like the aux and the Captor X. Now, I think a head and cabinet is a little bit more convenient, a little bit more useful over a combo. Next thing is going to be simplicity. How simple is your amp to use and get around? Obviously, this is a very simple amplifier. It's one channel. It's a 3-band EQ, meaning it's just bass, middle, and treble, and then there's a bright switch. So really simple, really easy to understand. There's one volume knob. There's no gain and master volume or multiple channels or really complicated tone stacks with tons of EQ options. Now for me, starting out, this was perfect because it was so simple. I got to really understand the amp really quickly. There wasn't a lot of things to figure out. Again, simple 3-band EQ, one volume, and a bright switch, and I was able to dial in tones quickly, which was really useful when I was gigging or doing my early session work. There wasn't a lot of time spent dialing in the sounds or tweaking the EQ or messing with my pedals to get the amp to sound right in the room. Basically, everywhere I went, this amp worked. So just flipped it on, dialed in the volume to the room that I was happening to be playing in, and that was it. I was off to the races. So it's easy to look back on your past decisions with hindsight and realize, man, I really wish I knew then what I know now. And looking back for me, I'm happy with this amp. I'm glad that I chose this as my first amp. It did a lot of good for me. But if you're in that position where you're looking to upgrade or move into a higher end tube amplifier or your first tube amplifier, the things to keep in mind are power rating. How loud does it need to be realistically? How are you going to be using it? How is it going to integrate in your rig? What role does the amp need to play for you in your rig? Does it need to be a blank slate or can it do more of the heavy lifting? What kind of sounds are you going for? Maybe take a listen to some of your favorite records and some of your favorite guitar sounds and try and figure out what styles of amplifiers those players were playing on those recordings. That can really help you narrow down your search in terms of amp style. Then think about the features that it needs to have and what it doesn't need to have. You can save money by not buying an amp with a built-in reverb if you're going to be using pedals or tremolo or an effects loop or multi-channel amps. If those are things that you don't need or don't want to have, there's no real use in spending money on them. And lastly, try and go play as much as you can. Take your guitar and maybe even your pedal board to your local music store and try out the amplifiers. Ask your shop if they've got a room that you can take the amp to and turn it up and actually hear what it does at high volumes. How quickly does it break up? How does it handle your pedal board? How does it make you feel when you play it? Does it make you feel confident and comfortable? Does it make you feel exposed? This is part of why I love tube amps so much. Each one does its own unique thing. They all respond differently. They all inspire you to play slightly differently, which is part of the reason I've become kind of a junkie for tube amps. But the downside of that is it can make the search for your first tube amp really difficult and really daunting, like it was for me about 11 or 12 years ago. So take your time, do your research, play as much as you can, and use these tips to help you find the right amp for you. If you enjoyed today's video, let me know by leaving a like and a comment down below. Don't forget to check out the tone course down below if you are searching for tips on good guitar tone. Check that out and get 35% off the tone course through the link in the description box. You can subscribe down there if you haven't done so already. This video is also not sponsored in any way. I will link to Port City's website if you want to know more information about the amp. I believe Daniel is still building this amp now, and he has a 100-watt version, which is crazy high headroom. But none of those are affiliate links or anything like that. No sponsorship going on here at all. My name is Rhett Shull. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, there is no plan B.